Hi, Fitzebra, Emma here. Are you ready for our next story on our journey on our magic carpet? So last time, our magic carpet took us on a ride to Italy. Today, our magic carpet is going to take us on a ride to Norway, and we are going to read a story by an author who comes from Norway, who is a man called Alf Presen. And Alf Presen has written lots and lots of different stories about a lady called Mrs. Pepperpot. Mrs. Pepperpot is very special because most of the time she is big, but all of a sudden she shrinks down to become tiny, the same size as a pepper pot. And she has all sorts of adventures when she shrinks. So the story that we're going to share today is called Mrs. Pepperpot Minds the Baby. Let's see what's going to happen. Let me tell you what happened the day Mrs. Pepperpot was asked to mind the baby. She was tidying the house when suddenly there was a knock at the door. In the porch stood her neighbour with her little boy on her arm. "Forgive me for knocking. You see, I simply have to go shopping in town today. I can't take Roger, and there's no one in the house to look after him." "Oh, that's all right," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "I'll look after your little boy." "You don't need to give him dinner," said the lady. "I've brought some apples for him." "Very well," said Mrs. Pepperpot, and put the apples in a dish. The lady said goodbye, and Mrs. Pepperpot set the baby down on the rug in the sitting room. Then she went out into the kitchen to fetch her broom to start sweeping up. At that very moment, she shrank. Oh dear, whatever shall I do?" she wailed, for now, of course, she was much smaller than the baby. "I must go and see what the little fellow is doing," she thought, as she climbed over the doorstep into the sitting room. Not a moment too soon, for Roger had crawled right across the floor and was about to pull the tablecloth off the table, together with a pot of jam, a loaf of bread, and a big jug of coffee. Mrs. Pepperpot lost no time. She looked about her and pushed over a large silver cup which was standing on the floor waiting to be polished. The cup made a loud booming noise as it fell, so the baby turned around and started crawling towards it. "That's right," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "You play with that. At least you can't break it." But Roger wasn't after the silver cup. Gurgling, "Want the dolly, want the dolly," he made a beeline for Mrs. Pepperpot, and before she could get away, he had grabbed her by her waist. He jogged her up and down, and every time Mrs. Pepperpot kicked and wriggled to get free, he laughed. "Tickle, tickle," for she was tickling his hand with her feet. Let go, yelled Mrs. Pepperpot. But Roger was used to his daddy shouting, "Let's go," when he threw him up in the air and caught him again. So Roger shouted, "Let's go," and threw the little old woman up in the air with all the strength of his short arms. Mrs. Pepperpot went up, nearly to the ceiling. Luckily, she landed on the sofa, but bounced over and over before she could stop. By the time she had caught her breath, Roger had found a pot of ink and was trying to open it. Mrs. Pepperpot had to think very quickly indeed. "Careful," she cried. Luckily, she found a nut in the sofa and threw it towards Roger, making him turn around. He dropped the ink pot and started crawling towards the sofa. "Want the dolly, want the dolly," he gurgled. And now they started a very funny game of hide and seek. At least it was fun for Roger, but not for poor old Mrs. Pepperpot. In the end, she managed to climb onto the sideboard. "Aha, you can't catch me now," she said, feeling much safer. But then the baby started back towards the pot of ink. "No, no, no," shouted Mrs. Pepperpot. Roger took no notice. She put her back against a flower pot and gave it a push. It fell to the floor with a crash. Straight away, Roger left the ink pot for this new mess of earth and bits of broken flower pot. He buried both his hands in it and started putting it in his mouth, gurgling, "Nice dinner." "No, no, no," shouted Mrs. Pepperpot once more. "Oh, whatever shall I do?" Her eyes caught the apples left by Roger's mother. One after one, she rolled them over the edge of the dish onto the floor. Roger watched them roll. Then he decided to chase them, forgetting his lovely meal of the earth. Soon the apples were all over the floor, and the baby was crawling happily from one to the other. Then there was a knock at the door. "Come in," said Mrs. Pepperpot. Roger's mother opened the door and came in, and there was Mrs. Pepperpot as large as life again. "Has he been naughty?" asked the lady. "As good as gold," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "We had a high old time together, haven't we, Roger?" And she handed him back to his mother. "I'll have to take you home now, precious," said the lady. But the little fellow began to cry. "Want the dolly, want the dolly," he sobbed. "Dolly," said his mother. "You didn't bring a dolly. You don't even have one at home." She turned to Mrs. Pepperpot. "I don't know what he means." "Oh, children say so many things grown-ups don't understand," said Mrs. Pepperpot, and waved goodbye to Roger and his mother. Then she set about cleaning up her house. So that is the story of Mrs. Pepperpot, the lady who can shrink down small, written by an author from Norway. Which country are we going to visit next? See you soon. Bye.